People think the hardest part of parenting is raising children, but they're wrong. The hardest part is realizing one day that the child you sacrificed your entire life for no longer sees your pain. The morning of my son Daniel's wedding was supposed to be one of the happiest days of our lives. My wife Helen woke up before sunrise, excited and nervous, moving around the hotel room carefully steaming dresses, answering calls from vendors, and checking decorations one last time even though none of it was technically her responsibility. That was just the kind of woman she was. For 32 years, Helen had spent her life taking care of everybody else before herself. She helped Daniel through college when we barely had enough money to cover our own bills. She worked extra shifts at the hospital so he could afford his first apartment. She even paid for part of this wedding quietly without wanting credit for it. And still, all she wanted that day was to see her son happy. The wedding venue looked beautiful from the outside. White flowers lined the garden path, giant crystal chandeliers hung beneath the reception tent, and expensive cars filled the parking lot while guests walked around smiling, with champagne glasses in their hands. But the second we arrived, something felt wrong. Vanessa, Daniel's fiancée, barely looked at Helen. There was no hug, no thank you for weeks of help, not even basic warmth. Instead, she shoved a clipboard into Helen's hands and immediately started giving her instructions about seating arrangements and late catering staff. My wife smiled politely and nodded while rushing off to fix problems that should have been handled by paid employees. What hurt me most wasn't Vanessa's behavior. It was Daniel standing there watching his own mother get treated like staff and saying absolutely nothing. Not once did he stop his fiancée. Not once did he tell his mother to sit down and enjoy the day. For the next few hours, I watched Helen work harder than anyone else at that wedding. While guests laughed and took pictures, she carried boxes, fixed decorations, cleaned tables, and helped servers organize dishes in the kitchen. At one point, I found her tying napkins because Vanessa thought the catering team wasn't doing it right. My wife was sweating in uncomfortable heels, exhausted, and still apologizing to everyone around her like she was somehow causing trouble. I pulled her aside and asked why she kept doing all this instead of enjoying her son's wedding. Helen simply smiled softly and said, "Vanessa's stressed. I don't want Daniel worrying today." That answer broke something inside me because even after being disrespected all morning, she still cared more about protecting everyone else's happiness than her own dignity. But the moment that changed everything happened an hour before the ceremony. I was walking past the bridal suite when I heard laughter from inside the room. At first, I ignored it until I heard Helen's name. Vanessa was sitting with her bridesmaids joking about how involved my wife had been with the wedding. Then Vanessa laughed and said, "Honestly, if Helen stopped acting like this wedding belongs to her, maybe people would remember she's just the groom's mother." The room burst into laughter. One of the bridesmaids joked that at least Helen was useful because she was basically free labor. Then Vanessa smirked and said something I'll never forget for the rest of my life. She said, "Some women are only happy when they feel needed like servants." My stomach dropped instantly because standing right outside the slightly open door was my wife holding a decoration box in her hands. She had heard every single word. Helen lowered her eyes quietly, adjusted her grip on the heavy box, and walked away without saying a single thing while the laughter continued behind her. And in that exact moment, I made a decision. The surprise gift I had planned for Daniel and Vanessa was gone. Completely gone. Because after what they had done to my wife, they didn't deserve a single dollar from me anymore. As the ceremony began, everyone around us saw what looked like a perfect wedding. Soft violin music floated through the garden while guests smiled, recorded videos, and whispered about how beautiful everything looked. Daniel stood proudly at the altar in his expensive tuxedo, while Vanessa walked toward him, like she was stepping into a movie scene. People clapped, some even cried, and photographers rushed around capturing every second like it was pure happiness. But while everyone else admired the wedding, I couldn't stop watching my wife. Helen sat quietly beside me with her hands folded tightly in her lap, forcing polite smiles whenever someone looked our way. After 32 years of marriage, I knew her better than anyone else in the world, and I could tell she was hurting badly. She wasn't angry or emotional on the outside. She was embarrassed. Embarrassed that she had been humiliated, laughed at, and treated like a servant at her own son's wedding, while still trying to protect everyone else's happiness. After the ceremony ended, the guests moved into the giant reception tent where music, laughter, and expensive food filled the room. But even there, Helen never got the chance to simply sit and enjoy herself like everyone else. While guests relaxed with drinks in their hands, she continued working nonstop. I watched her carry gift boxes to storage rooms, help waiters organize trays, and clean small messes around the tables while younger relatives ignored her completely. At one point, One of Vanessa's family members actually stopped my wife and asked her to bring more ice, because they thought she worked there. And instead of correcting them, Helen quietly nodded and went to get it. Watching that nearly shattered me. This woman had spent decades sacrificing for her family. And somehow, on the most important day of her son's life, she had become invisible. Then the speeches started. Vanessa's father stood first, giving a long emotional speech about family, love, and the future. Guests applauded loudly, while Daniel smiled proudly beside his new wife. Then my son grabbed the microphone himself. I remember sitting there honestly expecting him to thank his mother. I thought maybe he would finally acknowledge everything she had done for him. But instead, he thanked Vanessa's parents for helping create the perfect wedding. He thanked his friends, his co-workers, even the wedding planner. Meanwhile, my wife sat beside me quietly smiling while being completely ignored by the son she gave her entire life to. I looked over and caught Helen lowering her eyes toward the table, pretending she wasn't hurt. That moment changed something inside me forever. Because Daniel had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him later that night. 6 months earlier, Helen and I secretly bought a beautiful lakefront house for the newlyweds as a surprise wedding gift. I had worked for years building my construction company, sacrificing weekends, missing vacations, and saving every extra dollar possible so one day my family would have security and comfort. That house wasn't just property. It was years of hard work, sacrifice, and love wrapped into one final gift for our son's future. We planned to hand them the deed during the reception after the speeches ended. But as I sat there watching my wife quietly wipe tears while her own son ignored her existence, I realized something painful. They didn't deserve it anymore. Later during dinner, Vanessa finally walked over to our table, but not to apologize or thank Helen for everything she had done. Instead, she leaned down impatiently and whispered, "Helen, the dessert table looks messy. Can you fix it before guests start taking pictures?" For a second, I honestly couldn't believe what I was hearing. My wife had barely eaten all day. Her feet were swollen from hours of nonstop work, and this girl still treated her like hired help. Helen immediately started pushing her chair back to stand up, but before she could move, I placed my hand gently over hers under the table and looked directly at Vanessa. "No," I said calmly. Vanessa blinked in confusion and asked what I meant. I stared straight into her eyes and repeated myself quietly. "She's sitting down now." The table went completely silent. Vanessa forced an awkward smile like I was making some kind of joke, but I wasn't smiling back. After a few uncomfortable seconds, she rolled her eyes and walked away irritated. Across the room, I noticed Daniel watching the entire interaction happen. But once again, my son chose silence over defending his mother. And that was the exact moment I realized I wasn't losing my son because of Vanessa anymore. I was losing him because he was choosing to become exactly like her. The rest of the evening became almost unbearable for me to watch. Everywhere around us, guests were laughing, dancing, drinking champagne, and calling it the perfect wedding while my wife slowly disappeared into the background, like she didn't belong there at all. Even after being insulted earlier, Helen continued helping everyone around her because that was simply who she was. She adjusted decorations, helped waiters organize trays, answered questions from vendors, and even cleaned small messes before anyone else noticed them. Meanwhile, Daniel and Vanessa smiled for photos under glowing lights while people admired them like royalty. At one point during family pictures, the photographer loudly called for immediate family only. And before Helen could walk forward, one of Vanessa's bridesmaids stopped her and casually said, "Oh, sorry. Family only up front." The girl genuinely didn't even realize Helen was the groom's mother. I watched the embarrassment spread across my wife's face as she quietly stepped backward into the crowd without correcting anyone. That single moment hurt me more than anything else that day because it showed just how invisible they had allowed her to become. I wanted to explode right there in front of everyone. I wanted to walk straight to the center of the reception and remind every person in that tent exactly who Helen was and how much she had sacrificed for our son. But when I started moving forward, Helen gently grabbed my arm and whispered, "Please don't ruin Daniel's wedding." Even after everything, she still wanted to protect him. That's the kind of woman she had always been. Kind to the point of hurting herself. I sat back down beside her, but inside me something had already changed permanently. The anger wasn't fading anymore. It was growing. A little later, Daniel finally came over to speak with us while Vanessa stayed busy greeting guests nearby. For one small moment, I honestly thought maybe he had realized how badly his mother was being treated. Maybe he finally wanted to apologize. But instead, he smiled casually and asked if everything was okay because Vanessa thought I looked a little upset. Hearing that nearly made me laugh. Upset. My wife had spent the entire day being treated like hired staff at her own son's wedding, and that was how he described it. I asked Daniel if he had even noticed everything his mother had been doing since morning. He shrugged slightly and said weddings were stressful and everyone was just under pressure. Then he smiled awkwardly and said the sentence that completely destroyed whatever patience I had left inside me. Mom likes staying busy anyway. I stared at my son in complete disbelief after hearing those words. That was how he explained away her humiliation. Like she enjoyed being treated like a servant. Like all her sacrifices meant nothing more than being useful when convenient. In that moment, memories started flooding through my mind one after another. I remembered Helen working double shifts at the hospital so Daniel could attend college without debt. I remembered her secretly skipping meals sometimes when money was tight so Daniel never had to go without something he wanted. I remembered nights she stayed awake helping him study, while still waking up early for work the next morning. My wife gave that boy everything she possibly could for decades, and now he couldn't even give her basic respect for one single day. Before I could respond, Vanessa suddenly walked over holding a champagne glass with that same fake polite smile she had worn all evening. She wrapped one arm around Daniel and casually mentioned that important guest from her side of the family had arrived. Then she looked directly at Helen and said, "The bathrooms near the hallway are out of paper towels again." She said it naturally, comfortably, without even realizing how disgusting it sounded. Like my wife actually worked there. Helen immediately started pushing her chair back out of pure habit, ready to go handle it herself. But before she could stand, I stood up first. And this time, I was done staying quiet. I slowly reached inside my suit jacket and pulled out the large envelope I had carried with me. The entire night, the second Daniel saw it, his expression changed instantly because he knew it contained the surprise gift Helen and I had been hinting about for months. Vanessa's attention shifted immediately toward me as well. Guests sitting nearby started watching us curiously, expecting some emotional wedding moment. I looked directly at my son and calmly asked if he knew who helped pay for half this wedding. Daniel nodded slowly and said that we did. Then I asked him if he knew who spent weeks helping organize every detail of this day, while being treated like she didn't even belong there. Neither Daniel nor Vanessa answered me this time. The silence round the table suddenly became heavy. I placed my hand on top of the envelope, looked my son directly in the eyes and quietly said, "This envelope was supposed to change your future, but after the way you both treated your mother today, you don't deserve what's inside." For a few seconds, nobody at the table moved or even breathed properly. The music still played softly across the reception tent, glasses still clinked in the background, and guests nearby continued laughing, without realizing that an entire family was quietly falling apart only a few feet away from them. Daniel stared at the envelope in my hand with confusion slowly turning into panic, while Vanessa's fake smile completely disappeared for the first time all evening. Helen looked up at me in shock because she immediately understood what I was about to do. I could see it in her eyes. She knew the envelope contained the deed to the lakefront house we had secretly bought for them months earlier. That house was supposed to be our final gift to our son. Years of hard work, overtime, sacrifices, and savings wrapped into one future for the family we thought would appreciate it. But sitting there watching my wife get humiliated all day had changed everything inside me. Daniel laughed nervously at first like I couldn't possibly be serious. He asked me what I meant and said this wasn't the time for jokes. But I wasn't smiling. I looked directly at my son and calmly explained that the surprise gift inside the envelope no longer belonged to him. The moment those words left my mouth, Vanessa's expression changed instantly. Suddenly she looked far more interested in the conversation than she had all night. Daniel stared at me in disbelief and asked if I was seriously trying to embarrass him during his wedding reception. Hearing that almost made me angry enough to laugh. Embarrass him? After everything his mother had endured that day, that was still the only thing he cared about. His image, his comfort, his perfect wedding. I finally said out loud what I had been holding in for hours. I told Daniel that his mother had been treated like a servant from the moment we arrived. I reminded him how she spent the entire day carrying boxes, cleaning tables, helping staff, and running around exhausted while guests enjoyed themselves. I told him I heard Vanessa mocking Helen with her bridesmaids and laughing about her acting like a servant. The second those words came out, Vanessa's face turned pale. Daniel immediately looked toward his wife in confusion, clearly realizing this was the first time he was hearing about it. But instead of apologizing, Vanessa crossed her arms defensively and claimed everyone was just joking. Joking. That word made my blood boil instantly because cruel people always hide behind jokes. After getting exposed, Helen softly tried stopping me, whispering that we should discuss this privately later. But I couldn't stay silent anymore. Not after watching her spend the entire day swallowing humiliation just to protect people who clearly didn't deserve it. I told Daniel something he probably needed to hear years ago. I told him that marriage doesn't mean abandoning the people who spent their lives loving you. It doesn't mean standing silently while your mother gets disrespected in front of hundreds of people. And it definitely doesn't mean allowing someone else to turn your family into something disposable the second it becomes inconvenient. By now, several nearby guests had stopped talking and were openly watching us. The tension around the table became impossible to ignore. Daniel's face turned red with embarrassment while Vanessa looked furious that the attention was no longer centered on her perfect wedding image. Then Daniel finally snapped. He said I was overreacting and ruining the biggest day of his life over small misunderstandings. Small misunderstandings. Hearing him reduce his mother's pain to that nearly broke whatever little hope I still had left. I slowly looked toward Helen sitting beside me, quietly wiping tears from the corners of her eyes, while trying not to let anyone notice. And in that exact moment, my decision became final. Without another word, I opened the envelope, pulled out the property deed, and held it in front of Daniel long enough for him to recognize exactly what it was. His eyes widened instantly. Vanessa's mouth literally fell open in shock as she realized the value of what they had just lost. Before either of them could say a single word, I calmly folded the papers, placed them back inside the envelope, and tucked it into my jacket pocket again. Then I looked directly at my son and said quietly, "A house can build a future, Daniel. But respect is what holds a family together. And tonight, you lost both." After I put the envelope back into my jacket, the entire table fell completely silent. Even the guests nearby who had been secretly listening looked uncomfortable now, because everyone could feel something serious had just happened. Daniel stared at me like he didn't even recognize his own father anymore, while Vanessa's expression shifted between anger and panic. For the first time that entire day, neither of them seemed focused on the wedding. They were focused on what they had lost. But strangely, I didn't feel satisfaction in that moment. I felt disappointment, deep disappointment, because no parent dreams of reaching a point where they have to teach their grown child how to respect the woman who raised him. Daniel finally stood up from his chair and asked if I was seriously taking away their wedding gift over one bad day. One bad day. Hearing that hurt more than he realized, because to him, everything his mother experienced could still be reduced to something small and temporary. I looked at my son quietly for a few seconds before explaining that this wasn't about one day at all. It was about character, respect, gratitude. The way people reveal who they truly are when they think someone will continue loving them, no matter how badly they behave. I told him the house was never just money to us. It represented years of sacrifice from both me and Helen. Years of overtime, missed vacations, sleepless nights, and hard work meant to give our son a better future than we had. And if he could sit silently while his own mother was treated like she was beneath everyone else, then he wasn't mature enough to receive something built from her sacrifices. Vanessa suddenly interrupted and accused me of humiliating them publicly on purpose. She claimed Helen had misunderstood the jokes earlier and insisted nobody meant any real harm. But by then, her words sounded empty, because truly kind people don't repeatedly treat others with disrespect and then hide behind excuses after getting caught. Helen immediately tried calming the situation down like she always did, quietly saying we should all stop arguing and enjoy the wedding. Even after everything, she was still protecting them, still choosing peace over herself. I looked at my wife sitting there exhausted, emotionally drained, and still worrying about everyone else's feelings before her own. And that was the exact moment I realized something important. For too many years, Helen had spent her life accepting less respect than she deserved simply because she loved deeply. So for the first time in a very long time, I chose her first. I stood up slowly, held my wife's hand gently, and told her we were leaving. Daniel immediately looked shocked, probably believing we would eventually calm down and hand over the gift anyway. He followed us a few steps and asked if we were seriously walking out of his wedding reception. I turned back toward him one last time and told him something I hoped he would remember for the rest of his life. I told him that love without respect eventually turns into entitlement, and entitlement destroys families faster than anger ever could. Then I looked at Vanessa and calmly said that wealth can buy beautiful weddings, expensive flowers, and luxury houses, but it can never buy class or kindness. The room behind us stayed almost completely silent as Helen and I walked toward the exit together. I could feel hundreds of eyes watching us leave, but for the first time all day, my wife no longer looked embarrassed. She looked emotional, tired, and heartbroken, but there was also something else in her eyes: relief. Relief that someone had finally stood up for her after years of quietly enduring everything alone. When we stepped outside, the cold night air hit us softly, while distant music continued playing inside the reception tent. Behind us, Helen squeezed my hand tightly and asked in a quiet voice if I really meant what I said about the house. I looked at her and smiled gently before telling her yes, absolutely, because the truth was simple. I would rather spend the rest of my life in a small apartment with a woman who deserved the world than reward people who only valued her when she was useful to them. A few weeks later, Daniel called me several times, but not immediately. At first, there was silence, pride, anger. Then eventually came messages asking to talk. Helen cried after hearing his voicemail because despite everything, he was still her son. And maybe one day our family would heal. Maybe one day Daniel would truly understand what happened that night and why it mattered so much. But one thing had already changed forever. For the first time in decades, my wife finally understood that her kindness should never come at the cost of her dignity. And honestly, that was worth far more than any house I could ever buy.